Here we go. Let the fun begin.
Participants to please read the guidelines written on the updated cards on your table, measures that are in place to help prevent feedback incidents and protect the health and safety of all participants, including and especially our interpreters. There is a QR code on that card that links to a short awareness video if you need more information. Pursuant to the routine motion adopted by this committee, I can confirm that all the witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of this meeting. Please wait until I recognize you by name before you speak, and all comments should be through the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, September 22nd, 2025, this committee is meeting to study the state of the journalism and media sectors. So quite a broad study. And with us today, we have Travis Dhanraj, former journalist, Association des radiodiffuseurs communautaires du Québec, Angela Carrero, Executive Director, welcome. FreshNet News, Janet Clow and Mario Bartel. With Friends of Canadian Media, we have Raj Shone and Randy Kitt. Honest Reporting Canada, we have Mike Fegelman, Amanda Eskenazi, and Dr. Haran Shani Narkis. Please forgive me if I've butchered your name. And Paul Deegan from News Media Canada. Good to see you again, sir. So everyone or your organization will have 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then we'll open up the floor to members for questions. We'll start with Mr. Dhanraj. You have the floor now for 5 minutes, sir.
I have to press this? There we go. Appreciate it. Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. As a kid growing up in Alberta, I wasn't like most of my friends. Every night, I watched The National with Knowlton Nash. He represented a public broadcaster that belonged to Canadians. Not to power, not to party, but to the public. And that is the CBC that I believed in. Now, many Canadians know the story about one of my tweets. In April 2024, I publicly stated that Canada Tonight had requested an interview with then CBC President Catherine Tate, and the request was declined. Facts. Shortly after, I was removed from the air. Now, on May 7th, 2024, Tate told this very committee she was, quote, not aware of any repercussions. Yet 24 hours earlier, ATIP records show her vice president, Barb Williams, briefed her directly about my situation. Now, that matters because trust matters. The tweet was not the beginning. It was the breaking point. For months prior, tensions had been building, not over performance, but over control. While I was publicly held up as a bold, diverse host, my ability to lead the very program carrying my face and name was quietly being stripped away. CBC's stated commitment to diversity contrasted with realities of tokenism. Still, I pushed forward, creating a nightly panel to showcase real diversity, including of thought. I questioned unequal pay. Why, for example, one contributor who was Indigenous always needed to be paid, while others weren't. When a prominent black journalist requested compensation after appearing doing the exact same job, I was told to reconsider booking him. I attempted to end this discriminatory practice. Instead, the panel was canceled. When it came to politics, interviews were blocked under guardrails, governed by an internal document never made public, titled Parameters for Political Guests. Political access was centralized, booking decisions controlled elsewhere. It did not happen once. It became a pattern. It became the standard. Power in Politics, hosted by David Cochrane, was given gatekeeping authority over which politicians could appear on Canada Tonight. When I questioned that control and who was in control, I was viewed as disruptive. Now, at the same time, I raised concerns about a toxic environment. After I sat down with Speaker Greg Fergus for a conversation on Black History Month, Chief Political Correspondent Rosemary Barton circulated internal communications questioning my program, copying senior leadership, insinuating she or Mr. Cochrane should have done the interview. It was an intimidation tactic, which management ignored. I and others raised concerns about bullying behavior by senior figures, including Mr. Cochrane. But while he remained on air, I faced discipline and marginalization. Now, the transcripts of these meetings show the issue was not about my journalism, but about reputational risk to the corporation. I received a written warning carrying the threat of termination. I was placed under confidentiality restrictions that prevented me from correcting public and internal narratives. CBC silenced and intimidated me simply for trying to do my job and fulfill my public service role to Canadians. Now, this is not about left or right. It's not about one tweet or one career. It's about systemic control, tokenism, selective enforcement, and a toxic culture where intimidation went unchecked. When I refused to waive my rights under the Canadian Human Rights Act in a proposed confidentiality agreement right here and a gag order, essentially, my role was not renewed. My union, tasked with protecting my rights as an employee, told me explicitly, quote, "It's very much a normal thing that we use." After 25 years in journalism, my career ended. That dream I had as a kid of working at CBC shattered along with my trust in it. Now, inside the newsroom, the message was unmistakable and did not need to be spoken. I raised concerns. I challenged centralized control and bias. I fought for real diversity and equal standards. I tried to do my job as a journalist. Within months, I was pulled off the air, disciplined, restricted from speaking, stripped of my primetime program, and eventually out altogether. Now, if you were still working there, would you feel safe raising similar concerns? This is how silence becomes culture. It's how whistleblowers are intimidated. Public institutions do not weaken from scrutiny. They weaken when they avoid it. The CBC that I believed in was strong enough to withstand accountability. If it is to endure as a public broadcaster worthy of Canadians' trust and over $1.4 billion of their money, it must be strong enough to withstand it again. Accountability is not destruction, it is survival. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And next we go to Angelica Carrera for the Association des radiodiffuseurs communautaires de Québec. Excusez-moi, je ne sais pas si j'ai dit.
I don't know if I said your name correctly, but you have 5 minutes starting now. Thank you. Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some observations as part of the study on journalism and the media in Canada and Quebec. I would also like to commend the work of the committee, which made accurate and relevant recommendations in its third report. As the Executive Director of the Association of Community Radio Broadcasters of Quebec, I have the privilege of observing the work accomplished by these stations. We have 37 stations, radio stations, spread across the province, from Montreal to Matagami and the Île-de-la-Madeleine, for example. Most are francophone, but some are bilingual or anglophone, such as the station in Blanc-Sablon. They therefore cover a huge geographical area, sometimes with only meager revenues per year. The work they do is creative, tireless, and sometimes miraculous. There are also media outlets that have been around for many years, which have stood the test of time despite the difficulties. The vast majority of stations employ at least one journalist, sometimes 2 or 3 or 4, for a total of about 50 journalists who work to provide local news coverage rooted in the reality of their respective communities. Community radio stations have always enjoyed the public's trust, and this was confirmed by a study conducted by our association in 2024. Furthermore, it is not enough to simply say that you are doing local journalism. You have to actually do it. The physical presence of journalists in community stations is to be distinguished from cases where news is generated by means other than humans, or where broadcasts merely relay information from the largest nearby urban center. But in addition to the physical presence of journalists and all their volunteers, because there are many volunteers, it is their mission and raison d'être that make them excellent ambassadors for the local community. Their mission is to serve the community in which they are rooted. In fact, it is the community that creates and manages the radio station that has the community's interests at heart. It is important to remember that these are non-profit media outlets. and they play an essential role in protecting freedom of the press and defending the public's right to quality information. Their content is diverse, nonpartisan, comprehensive, and reliable. We therefore provide the kind of local journalism that the committee refers to in its second recommendation. And it is true to say that it needs support, a lot of support. Indeed, as I said at the beginning, community radio stations operate on meager revenues that are dwindling year after year. And when people seem to say they are heavily subsidized, that is very unfortunate because the only provincial subsidy they receive for their operations does not even cover the normal salary of one of the company's employees, or barely. These subsidies are difficult to renew, even after many years. For the federal government, we have the Local Journalism Initiative, which we really appreciate, and a little project funding is offered for those who manage to qualify, but it is not enough. Fortunately, we are stepping up our efforts to promote the Community Radio Initiative, which could be managed by the Community Radio Fund of Canada, in an attempt to increase the funds available to all community radio stations in the country. We are asking the government for annual operating funding of approximately $30 million to provide around $85,000 per station, which is still very modest compared to the funding provided or needed by other broadcasters. This assistance would help ensure basic financial viability. Otherwise, radio stations must rely on advertising revenue to try to make up for this shortfall. But as several experts have already pointed out, this advertising revenue has clearly shifted to foreign platforms which are gobbling up almost everything. This is not new. Canadian government money is being used to grow the financial assets of large American companies, multinationals. This goes against the buy local policy promoted by this same government. I would also like to highlight the work we are doing along with our two sister associations, the NCRA, the National Campus and Community Radio Association, and the Alliance of Community Radio Broadcasters of Canada, to try to issue a clear directive on local advertising. A specific portion would be systematically allocated to community advertising. Together, our three associations represent independent, non-profit community radio stations across Canada. We believe that this directive would encourage governments to allocate more of the funds that are already there but used elsewhere to local media. It is a reallocation of existing funds. It's not a new request. But above all, we believe that advertising broadcast in this way would have a much greater and more lasting impact on Canadians. As the Government of Canada continues to invest in public communications to raise awareness of its programs and services, it is increasingly important to ensure that these messages are delivered through channels that truly reach the intended audiences, rather than through digital giants that have no roots or support in Canada. Advertising that does not take into account geographic, linguistic, or digital barriers risks leaving some communities confused and misinformed. In short, the general idea is to help the government fulfill its mission of informing the country's entire population and having a more significant impact on it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Claude and Mario Bartel from Freshnet News. Collectively, you have 5 minutes. I'm not sure how you want to share that.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this committee. My name is Mario Bartel.
And my name is Janice Clue. And along with Teresa McManus and Cornelia Naylor, we are the co-founders of Freshnet News, the first nonprofit news cooperative in Western Canada that's union supported. We are veteran community news reporters, editors, paginators, with more than 100 years of combined experience covering New Westminster, Burnaby, and the Tri-Cities in British Columbia, approximately 600,000 people outside of the city of Vancouver. Last April, Glacier Media, now called Lodestar Media, closed our 3 online publications, the New Westminster Record, Burnaby Now, and Tri-City News, in the middle of the federal election. It meant we couldn't cover the all-candidates meetings, our candidates couldn't get their messaging out, and our readers were lost about who to vote for. This is dangerous to democracy.
When I originally landed at the Tri-City News in 1991, virtually every community in the Lower Mainland was served by at least 2 local papers. Consolidation and closures winnowed that down to 1 in most communities by 2015. Then, in August 2023, the same month our Meta social media shut down, Glacier Media stopped printing our newspapers altogether. The company said online was the only way forward. It wasn't. Less than 2 years later, 5 rapidly growing cities and 2 villages immediately east of Vancouver were left with little or no local news source. That meant decisions made at city halls and school boards got no independent coverage. There were no stories about young athletes and emerging artists, no coverage of local events, festivals, parades.
What may have been no longer economically viable to Glacier Media was untenable to the journalists who have dedicated their careers to sharing those stories. After all, we live in those communities too. So the 4 of us got together with a co-op developer, and with the support of our union, Unifor Local 2000, we put together a plan to keep our communities informed. We spent the summer and early fall of 2025 learning about co-op structures and governance, fundraising, and doing community outreach. People told us they didn't know what was happening in their hometowns anymore.
On October 15th, we launched Freshet News Online, a single title covering all our communities. It's named for the annual spring runoff from the northern snows that washed down the Fraser River past our cities. It symbolizes renewal, a fresh start. 2 months later, we revived a print edition. We're monthly for now, but we plan to increase to twice a month in April, with our ultimate goal to return to weekly publication. We're 4 journalists who never had to give much thought to the business side of our craft, the ads that ran between our stories, and the distribution network that got those stories to readers.
The learning curve has been steep, but our journalism skill set has made us adept to changing gears when needed. The communities are responding. Our website traffic grows every week, as do subscriptions to our weekly email newsletter. Advertisers are eager to get into our newspaper, and readers are scooping up the newspapers, 20,000 of them, from our distribution points at city halls, community and cultural recreation hubs, grocery stores, coffee shops, and barber shops, senior residences. We even get calls to replenish.
We truly feel our model of nonprofit, locally rooted journalism that's accountable to the communities we serve is a way forward as corporate media gives up. But what we're doing is not new. In fact, across the United States, as corporate media abandons communities due to lack of profits, reporter-led news organizations and collectives are filling the gap. Still, supports are lacking for journalism startups in Canada. We've come this far mostly on a volunteer basis as we continue looking for jobs. Our severance and EI benefits have dried up. Our fundraising at community events and through an online crowdfunding platform has comprised mostly small individual donations, $10, $25, $100 at a time. We don't have charitable status, so we can't issue tax receipts that might shake loose transformative big money support. Foundation funding frequently looks for a proven history, something that's difficult for a startup to provide. Grant opportunities are often like fitting a square peg into a round hole, and the few that are journalism specific, like the Local Journalism Initiative, are already oversubscribed and don't provide funding for critical supports like hiring ad reps who can bring in ad revenue or covering costs like software subscriptions, insurance, printing, and distribution.
Make no mistake, many of the media's industry's wounds are self-inflicted. Too much growth too quickly back when times were flush, too much consolidation, too many resources expended chasing bad ideas, too many owners that are investors rather than people who believe in the mission of news. Those owners would have us believe the news business is dead. But from our experience in the past few months, since we started Freshet News, has been quite the opposite. People want to be connected to each other and their communities, free from algorithms. Businesses want to share their stories with local customers, and journalists want to be able to write and keep sharing the stories. Putting community back into community news is the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very effective use of sharing your time. And as a former community reporter, I really appreciate your efforts. Thank you for all you're doing. Next, we have the Friends of Canadian Media, Raj Shone and Randy Kitt. I expect an equally engaging back and forth between the two of you. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Chair, members of the committee, Friends is a nonpartisan public interest organization dedicated to ensuring that Canadians have access to strong, independent Canadian journalism and storytelling. We advocate for citizens, not for corporations, because a healthy media system is essential to a healthy democracy. Let me begin plainly. The state of journalism in Canada is poor, and in most communities, it is deteriorating further. Over the past decade and a half, hundreds of local news outlets have closed across the country. Millions of Canadians now live in communities with little or no local news coverage. Newsrooms have shrunk. Journalists have been laid off. Entire beats have disappeared. This is not simply an industry transition. It's a democratic deficit. Local journalism scrutinizes municipal councils. It covers courts. It informs citizens about public health, education, and emergencies. When journalism disappears, civic participation declines, polarization increases, and misinformation fills the vacuum. Governments have taken important steps, including the Journalism Labor Tax Credit, the Local Journalism Initiative, the Online News Act, the Online Streaming Act, and support for CBC. These measures matter. They demonstrate recognition that journalism is not just another sector, it's democratic infrastructure. But the structural disruption facing Canadian journalism remains profound. The economic model that sustained local news has been destabilized by global digital platforms that capture advertising revenue while investing minimally in Canadian news production. That brings me to 5 areas where federal leadership is essential. First, the Online News Act and the Online Streaming Act are critical to creating a sustainable funding framework for local news. These laws must not be weakened, traded away, or hollowed out through exemptions or side deals. Regulatory certainty and enforcement are essential. Second, eligibility for the Journalism Labor Tax Credit should be expanded to include broadcasters. Broadcast newsrooms, particularly local television and radio, face financial pressures similar to print. They too are pillars of local accountability. Third, Parliament should close the loophole in Section 19 of the Income Tax Act that allows full deductibility of advertising on foreign digital platforms. Canadian advertising dollars should not receive preferential tax treatment when they're directed to foreign platforms rather than Canadian outlets. Fourth, the federal government should commit to directing at least 25% of its advertising budget to trusted domestic news organizations, both publishers and broadcasters, big and small. This would strengthen local journalism while ensuring Canadians receive critical public information through reliable channels. Fifth, Canadian news creators must be protected from having their content used by artificial intelligence companies without permission or compensation. Copyright protections, licensing frameworks, and transparency requirements must ensure journalism is not harvested without value flowing back to those who produce it. Finally, a vibrant CBC is part of a strong ecosystem, alongside successful private and independent media. As the national public broadcaster, it plays a foundational role in connecting regions, serving official language minority communities, and maintaining news capacity where commercial models are under strain. I will now turn to my colleague, Randy Kidd.
Thank you, Raj. Chair, members of the committee. Unifor represents approximately 9,000 media workers across Canada. In the last several years alone, hundreds of journalists and media employees have lost their jobs. When newsrooms shrink, the consequences are immediate. Fewer reporters at City Hall, fewer investigative projects, fewer rural correspondents, and more reliance on centralized news content. And yet, the demand for reliable information has never been greater, as Freshet News can tell you. We are living through a period of geopolitical instability, rising inflation, and increased public cynicism. Journalism is one of the few professions capable of grounding public debate in verified fact. Failing to stabilize Canadian journalism means surrendering not just jobs, but our sovereignty. Losing our local accountability, shared facts, and democratic resilience that safeguard our nation's independence. Journalism is essential to a functioning democracy, and the Canadian government should treat it like a national park, something that must be nurtured, protected, and properly funded for future generations.
A strong journalism sector is not a luxury. It's infrastructure for democracy, and it's imperative that we sustain it. We thank the committee for undertaking the study and stand ready to assist.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Honest Reporting Canada. I have Mike Fegelman in the room. Do you have colleagues online? I don't. Oh, they are. Here we go. Are you all joining in the 5-minute opening?
They'll be joining in the Q&A component.
Okay, very good. Very good. You have the floor now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. My name is Mike Fegelman, and I'm the Executive Director of Honest Reporting Canada. We're a nonprofit organization that ensures fair and accurate Canadian media coverage of Israel. We started more than 20 years ago, but the overt media bias that we have experienced and seen over the last 2.5 years has made that era look quaint by comparison. Just hours after thousands of Palestinian terrorists invaded Israel on October 7th, carrying out an orgy of murder, rape, torture, and kidnappings, our taxpayer-funded broadcaster leapt into action. In a letter to editorial staff, George Ahey, CBC's former Director of Journalistic Standards and Practices, warned journalists not to use the word terrorists when referring to Hamas, not to admit that 2005 was the end of Israel's permanent presence in Gaza, which it was, and even when Canadian officials refer to Hamas as terrorists. Ahey wrote that reporters, quote, should add context to ensure that audiences understand this is opinion, not fact, end quote. Hamas is, of course, a listed terrorist organization. It soon became clear for the CBC and for wide swaths of the Canadian media landscape, their role was not to report the facts to Canadians, but to use their immense influence in society to promote a narrow ideological agenda. Present-day news outlets parrot talking points from pro-Palestinian activists and overwhelmingly feature guests with a predictable anti-Israel worldview, presenting them as credible while choosing not to include opposing voices. When anti-Israel groups sneeze, it achieves wall-to-wall news coverage. When Amnesty International accuses Israel of committing a genocide, going so far as to make up a new definition in order to do so, or when a discredited group of non-experts make such claims, they get widespread coverage. Yet when scholars documented Hamas's fabricated death toll or penned a comprehensive report demonstrating that no genocide took place, they were ignored by our media. The unfounded claims of genocide and starvation were promoted ad nauseum by our media. And as it soon became clear that those allegations were false, reporters didn't apologize. They simply moved on. Now, like a cat chasing a laser dot on the wall, the worst offenders in anti-Israel media bias in Canada, whether the CBC, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, or others, take their cues not from what's newsworthy, but rather what complaints are being made by pro-Palestinian activists. When reporters document the worrying rise of Islamic radicalism in Canada, the presence of Iranian regime officials in our nation, or the impact of Qatari dark money in Canadian universities, they are treated as persona non grata. When a Canadian mosque recently honored Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei and glorified him as a martyr, our journalists ignored this brazen support for terrorism. Our journalists have a solemn duty to hold the powerful to account, to not act as their water carriers. But that's what they've done, promoting hardline anti-Israel disinformation and acting as unpaid publicists for an immense web of extremist actors in Canada. This media coverage directly contributes to a spike in anti-Jewish hate crimes. When Israel is painted as a genocidal and pariah state, and opponents are widely silenced, a target is drawn on the back of Canadian Jews. The incessant demonization of Israel, and by extension Jews, has led to an unprecedented attack on the Jewish community, with terrorist rallies now a regular occurrence on Canadian streets, and Jewish schools and synagogues, as we saw this past week.
Bonjour tout le monde.
While far too many elected leaders and law enforcement ignore this cancer that is in our midst. Over the past 2 years, our media promoted ideology over facts, and in the case of the CBC, did so at the taxpayers' expense. I'm happy to recount numerous examples of Canadian ways that we have confronted. When our media act as stenographers for a regressive and hateful worldview, it's not reporting the news, it is creating it. And when our leaders stay silent, they let it happen. Our elected leaders must take the lead to remedy the situation. In my written testimony and submission to this committee, I've offered 3 concrete courses of action that you can take directly to counter these critical issues, and I would be happy to elucidate them today for anyone interested. As well, I've brought with me here today 2 colleagues, Dr. Haran Shani-Narkis, CEO of InnoHives, and Amanda Eskenazi, Director of Education at HR Canada Charitable Organization. They conducted a comprehensive review of the CBC's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war and have provided real scientific evidence of asymmetric coverage. It isn't an opinion that the CBC is one-sided. We now have scientific, irrefutable proof. Canadian taxpayers fund public broadcasters to provide accurate, impartial, and reliable information. When media outlets choose ideology over facts, they fail in this fundamental duty, leaving Canadians misinformed on issues of national security, on issues of terrorism and international conflict. This is not merely a concern for one community. It affects every Canadian's right to understand the world as it truly is. Restoring trust in our media is not a partisan issue, but a national imperative. Parliament must act now to ensure that our media serve Canadians with facts, with fairness, and with integrity, because an informed public depends on it, and our democracy requires it. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, we have Paul Deegan with News Media Canada. Welcome, sir. You have 5 minutes, starting now.
Bonjour. Média d'Info Canada représente environ
News Media Canada represents about 550 news titles across Canada, from independent weekly community newspapers to large urban and national dailies.
The advertising market in Canada continues to remain very challenging. Simply put, too many ad dollars are being scooped up by Google. Last year, a U.S. federal court judge ruled that Google, which operates in all three areas of the market, the buying, the selling, and the ad exchange itself, illegally monopolized the ad tech market through anti-competitive conduct. News publishers fully embrace and support the responsible and ethical use of artificial intelligence. At the same time, despite deploying bot blockers, we are seeing the theft of our intellectual property on an industrial scale. Companies like Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, which is familiar to all of you in terms of the role their employees didn't play in alerting authorities to the Tumblr Ridge incident, Perplexity, and even Canada's Cohere are ingesting, repackaging, and distributing copyright-protected content directly from published news articles. These companies aren't just providing snippets that one would find through a traditional search. They're providing very detailed summaries and passing it off as their own creation. They're depriving news publishers of audience, subscriptions, and advertising, capturing the value journalism depends on for its survival. Moreover, Google, which is dominant in search, has embedded AI-generated summaries directly into their search interface without providing publishers with an effective opt-out mechanism. If publishers want to block Google's AI crawler, they find themselves de-indexed or unable to attract traffic to their sites. News is an essential input to the knowledge economy. It helps people, businesses, and investors make better, more informed, real-time decisions. It's also a necessary input for the output of the AI companies. But the value transfer cannot be asymmetric. The user needs to pay the creator. The content theft by AI companies must stop, and government can help. First, Public Services and Procurement Canada and Treasury Board can work together to ensure that those on the government's list of artificial intelligence suppliers, and there's 100 and somewhat companies on that list, sign a supplier agreement that states that they will use AR material ethically with a commitment to the principles of transparency, consent, and attribution with respect to all copyright-protected source content. Second, the industry minister can ask the Comp Bureau to look into the state of competition with respect to search and AI. Googlebot should be split into two crawlers, one for AI and one for search. That would help level the playing field between publishers and Google and between other AI companies and Google. Those companies have no incentive to sign commercial agreements with publishers when Google's AI services are getting the content for free. Third, the Copyright Act should not be amended to include a text and data mining exception or be weakened in any way. Rights holders must be protected, no exceptions. On the positive side, the Online News Act, while imperfect, is working for Canadian news publishers. Prior to the Act, and in an effort to thwart it, Google and Meta did content licensing deals with a number of news publishers. Most of our members, however, were left out in the cold, without a cent. Today, whether you're a large publisher or a smaller independent, you're getting about $16,400 per year per full-time journalist. For example, the World Spectator from Moosomin, Saskatchewan received almost $80,000 last year. Prior to the Online News Act, most of our members never saw a dime in content licensing from these American big tech firms. Between the Online News Act and the Canadian Journalism Labour Tax Credit, which rewards those who maintain and grow journalism jobs, there's finally a level of predictability for business planning, which is translating into a level of stability in many newsrooms, where we are seeing investment after years of cost cutting. Both these measures should be maintained. Let me turn briefly to government advertising. Despite the government's stated Buy Canadian policy, changing its agency of record, and spending tens of millions of dollars each year, news publishers are not seeing any meaningful federal government ad dollars. Yet when a bank, a retailer, or a car company runs a national or regional campaign, news publishers do okay. That's because their chief marketing officers know we are a great way to reach and engage Canadians. So why are we only seeing micro pennies on the dollar when it comes to the federal campaigns? It's simple. The government's agency of record is doing what is easiest and most profitable for them, and that's programmatic advertising through American big tech firms. We hope the committee will recommend an advertising set-aside that you heard about earlier. An ad set-aside done right on the publishing side, we, for example, reach 86% of Canadians who engage with newspaper content each week. It's time for the government to think more like a marketer who cares about reach and efficacy. We can help you reach engaged audiences better than anyone. For advertisers, whether governments or the private sector, credible journalism strengthens trust while delivering better business results in a brand-safe environment. There's absolutely no reason the federal government shouldn't use Canadian news brands to inform Canadians. Nous vivons dans une ère de désinformation.
We're in an age of misinformation and disinformation amplified by algorithms. Facts are essential. Quality information created by real people who have fact-gathering, fact-checking, editorial, and legal review, and being accountable costs real money. Thank you. Thank you.
Members, questions from members, starting with Mrs. Thomas for 6 minutes. You have the floor.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you to each of you for being here today. My first set of questions is going to go to Mr. Dhanraj. Mr. Dhanraj, I'm just curious, there was a document that you talked about in your opening remarks called Parameters for Political Guests. Would you be willing to table that with the committee?
I would.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Appreciated. Now, I just want to get to the bottom of this. Can you talk a little bit about any pressure that you experienced at the CBC to shape stories in a particular fashion?
Sure, I can, but I do want to spend part of my time, because I am here speaking, and this is my story, but over the past several days, and even when this story initially came out, there have been other CBC employees, current and former, that have come forward to me that are afraid to speak out publicly, and they have sent me some statements. So I'd like to, if I can, read into the record some of what I have been getting from current and former employees. This is a current employee at the CBC. I've been with CBC for 10 years, and I have witnessed and experienced multiple incidents of the misuse of taxpayer dollars, racism, favoritism, nepotism, sexual harassment, and verbal abuse. And then she goes on to outline specific examples. This next individual was someone that you would all know if I said their name. They left the CBC after a 10-year career. The end of their statement says, without exaggeration, I experienced toxicity every single day, and it was almost always from the same people. It was not subtle. It was not hidden. It was part of the daily reality of working there. She goes on to say that she was set to interview Catherine Tate on air. I introduced myself to her in the makeup room as the host. In front of others, she responded, I didn't know I'd be interviewed by somebody who looks like she is 14. That moment stayed with me. It was dismissive, inappropriate, and reflected a broader culture in which respect was not always equally extended to everyone. On Mr. Cochran, this was one of his former producers. His toxic behavior extended beyond editorial matters and was more often than not deeply hypocritical. While he publicly presented himself as a supporter of diversity, he actively undermined the contributions of colleagues who were minorities. This is somebody who left the industry and had to go to another country. After about a year of working there as an anchor, this is in Vancouver, I was suddenly removed from the anchor desk. I was told the decision was related to the color of my skin, that as a white person, I did not fit the diversity targets they were trying to meet. No concerns about my performance had ever been raised. My concern was the system and the reasoning behind the decision. My frustration was never directed at the individual who stepped into the role. She was also said that she was forced to check a box if somebody of a diverse background appeared on the air. And she said that that was concerning to her. I believe it's important to include a broad range of voices and perspectives, but reducing interview subjects to a check box felt like an overly simplistic way of approaching something that deserves much more care and thought. And I can go on. There are a number of these stories, and it is shocking. These people have been traumatized. They are scared to come out. They are scared of the professional repercussions. And management, like Andre Lau, like Brody Fenlon, like Kathy Perry, like Chris Carter, they are concerned about protecting the reputation of the organization as opposed to dealing with these issues when it comes to employees.
So, Mr. Dhanraj, during your time there, can you just outline what years were you there?
I was there. I finished at Global, I think, in 2021. Okay. It's in the bio that I provided.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
And then I came to Ottawa. I was a parliamentary reporter. I flew around with the Prime Minister. I covered Parliament Hill. I was. Then I went back to Toronto. I was on Marketplace. I covered the Queen's funeral, and then I got my own show, which I thought, I'd have some say in terms of how that show went. And on the intersection panel. This is a picture here of all the folks that we had on the panel. We've got here one with Raheem Mohammed and Rachel Gilmore. I don't know if you can get two people very far apart on the ideological spectrum as that. Sheila Copps, Brian Lilly, and Faye Johnston, right? We were having the Canadian conversation, and this panel was canceled. And you also have issues of pay equity when it comes to all of these folks.
So obviously your point here was to create a panel that was full of diversity, not just in skin color or ethnicity or religious background perhaps, but you wanted diversity of thought.
Correct.
Were you given the journalistic freedom then to move forward and do that for the sake of the Canadian public?
No, I mean, the issue became with the panelists, we had a list of 43 people or 45 people that Power and Politics gave us that said, do not go near these people, right? And some of these folks were like reporters, like Robert Benzie. There's a story breaking at Queen's Park, and we're on at 7 o'clock. We should be able to call, somebody who covers Queen's Park and talk to them. But there were these continued hurdles and roadblocks that were set up to really have a certain group of folks in Ottawa in control of who was allowed on programs. Particularly mine was a concern. And there were repeated episodes of conservatives being blocked. I mean, I have the G chats right here. I said, in terms of getting folks on, that we need to have balance. This is not about just having a show with conservatives or just with liberals. But if Power and Politics is going to have liberals talking points on all the time, we should have balance as a network. And I said, we are in contravention of Section 11 of, I told Brody Fenlon this, and also Andre Lau, repeatedly. We are in contravention of the Broadcasting Act if we are not providing equitable time for all perspectives. So I don't want to flood the show with conservatives, but I do want to have balance. And there are, and this is all, I can talk to my legal team because some of this is before the Human Rights Commission in terms of how this happened, but there were repeated attempts over and over and over again. At one point, I heard, okay, well, maybe you can have NDP folks on, but conservatives are a no. It should blow the Canadian public's mind that this was the stuff that was going on.
Mr. Alcide, you have the floor now for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for those opening remarks. My first question is for Ms. Clue and Mr. Bartel. Firstly, it's a pleasure to meet you both. Ms. Royer speaks very fondly of you. I'd like to focus on a highlight of your opening remarks. You noted a lack of support. I quoted this because I thought it was interesting and well said. Grant opportunities are like fitting a square peg into a round hole. From your experience in building a new outlet, what are the biggest barriers facing independent journalism, startups in Canada, and what do you believe would best help address those barriers?
Well, we're we're journalists, and you know, we've run head on and into some of the challenges of creating a viable business and some of the costs of that. You know, the local journalism initiative has stepped up with some funding for us, so that helps cover some wage for our crew. But you know, that doesn't deal with, we need to hire someone who can sell ads. We don't know how to do that. We shouldn't be doing that. We're journalists. So we want to maintain that separation between the ad side and the journalism side. So luckily we have found some people who are willing to help us and off the side of their desks and get us going. But you know, to go forward, to ramp up, we have to become professional at every level of this. And so, you know, some of that infrastructure support is critical to this. You know, we ran in headlong into just how expensive some of these things are, software licenses to get to allow us to produce a newspaper, web hosting fees, insurance, all these things that we were completely oblivious to in our role in the newsroom have come home to roost. And you know, luckily our crowdfunding gave us a good foundation to start tackling some of these things. But again, as we move forward, becoming a viable business will mean backfilling a lot of those things with support.
Fantastic. Over the past few years, certainly we've seen a significant number of community newspapers close or reduce their reporting capacity. You highlighted this in your opening remarks. From your perspective as a longtime local journalist, reporter, could you speak to what happens to community accountability and civic engagement when local news coverage disappears? I believe you highlighted that it was dangerous to local democracy, but I'm keen to see you expand on that if possible.
We became a news desert. We have news deserts and news-poor jurisdictions. And Glacier Media closing us in the middle of the federal election was quite bad. So we've had people pretending to be reporters sit at the media desk in council meetings, and they're reporting when we're not. So that's dangerous.
Perfect, thank you. Madame Carrero, l'ARCQ représente
Ms.
37...
Carrero, your association represents 37 different radio stations. As you know, many community radio stations depend on volunteers and limited funding. What are the biggest operational challenges that community radio is facing today? I'm thinking of lower advertising revenue, digital disruptions with foreign platforms. Well, you stated it well. There are all of the operations done by volunteers, which isn't ideal because even though those volunteers give their time, dedicate themselves, make these radio stations work, any operation that is based on that model is hard to keep up over the years. But it's the case. They manage. But funding for operations, that's the basic need. That's what they need. And it's what they don't have. And then advertising revenue. As I said, and others have said, advertising revenue aren't there anymore. It's gone to foreign platforms. So it would be very good to have a clear government directive. And then radio stations could contribute to getting the government's message through. And then you mentioned the digital transition. That's another element. That's a major challenge. Radio stations are cornerstones for their community. They're on the FM station, but also on the web. They can be listened to. There are podcasts, news. So these are really complete media outlets, but we need to help them with the digital transition. It can be harder depending on the station.
Parfait. Mr.
Great.
Canada's broadcasting and media regulatory framework was designed at a time when traditional television and radio dominated the landscape. Given the rapid rise of global streaming platforms and digital media companies, do you believe Canada's existing regulatory tools are still adequate for protecting Canadian journalism and cultural sovereignty in the digital age?
I believe the tools are there. I think perhaps the CRTC has been a little bit slow in terms of taking action. The CRTC has done some good things, and certainly the Government of Canada has done some good things. The Online Streaming Act, the Online News Act has been enormously helpful. The tax credit has been helpful, the Local Journalism Initiative. The CRTC made a very important decision last year to ask streamers to contribute a base contribution of 1.5% of its annual revenue to support local news. That's being challenged in court right now, but we feel confident it will go the CRTC's way. Those are all important steps, but more needs to be done, especially given the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives conclusion that a significant portion of the Canadian population, I believe it's 2.5%, have access to no local news or only one local news outlet. So that's really a problem that needs to be corrected. The tools are there, and the regulator needs to be encouraged to use them.
Merci. Maintenant,
Thank you. Now we go to Mr. Shampoo for 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses today. We have a great panel who represent the importance of the topic we are covering with the study. Madam Chair, before speaking to the witnesses, I'd like to table a motion. I've discussed it with a few members around the table. It's a motion that I will read, and I'd like us to keep a little time at the end of the meeting to debate it. I will read it, and then we can discuss it a little later to not interrupt questions to witnesses. It is a motion being tabled in relation to Radio-Canada's decision to offer its programming, its news, on the Prime Video platform owned by Amazon. We find that this is a decision that needs to be explained and questioned. So the motion is that, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee invite the CEO of CBC Radio-Canada, Marie-Philippe Bouchard, to appear before the committee for a minimum of 2 hours to explain the decision to make Ici RDI's programming available on the Prime Video platform owned by the American multinational Amazon, even before it is made available to Quebecers and Francophones in Canada on Tout.tv or on a Canadian-owned platform. Madam Chair, I've prepared this in French and English. It's available to committee members. If I may, I'd like to ask us to reserve time at the end of the meeting today to discuss this motion so we can explain the spirit of this request from the Bloc Québécois. I think everyone agrees. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Once again, thank you to all of the witnesses for joining us today. I think this is an extremely important study. It's a very concerning topic, and the variety of media perspectives here are a testament to that. I'll start with Ms. Carrero, because we've heard a lot about community media, and we know that times are tough. Support isn't what is needed. I also want to ask a question to Mr. Deegan, who represents written media, but you talked about the local journalism initiative. Have you noticed a decrease in support through that program for your members? Is the support still what your members need it to be? Because I know it's essential for local coverage in Quebec and elsewhere. So what is the state on the ground for your members with the local journalism initiative? Yes, the LJI is something we appreciate. It's funding that's there for stations. We haven't noticed a specific decrease as such. Stations request it and they hope to obtain it. However, we always hope it will be renewed in time for budget 2026. That's what we are hoping for. And sometimes, even if a station has that LJI, it needs to be possible to hire someone. It's not just getting the subsidy, but being able to use it. But that's another kettle of fish, but I just wanted to mention it. The LJI is something we really appreciate, and we really hope to see it renewed in budget 2026. I'd like to ask a question to Paul Deegan as well. I know your members often use that very important program, the Local Journalism Initiative. For written media, it's very important. Andréane Larouche, the member for Shefford, received from the Val West newspaper in her area. She was told that the funding had decreased by 30% this year, which has a huge impact on small written media in the regions and community outlets. Is this a concern you've seen at News Media Canada?
Oui, pour les journaux de...
Yes. For newspapers, it's about 37,000 per journalist this year. But we have about 200 journalists under this program. It's very important for weeklies and other independent community media. Have you heard from your members that the program was less generous with them this year? Yes, yes. So there's still the expectation that this program would be increased, which is necessary to address media deserts. Media deserts, news deserts are everywhere. Thank you very much. Back to you, Ms. Carrero. We heard earlier about artificial intelligence, and this will be coming up often in the study, surely. As community media, I imagine you don't use AI to prepare the news and broadcast it, but some media are using that technology due to economic reality, but often they use programs that you don't have access to. So what is your perspective on that distortion in the equity of the rules? I imagine it wouldn't be a cause for celebration. Correct. I think you are correct. Community radio is based on principles that they try to keep up. And if there are people who could use AI, it would be community radio stations because they don't have staff. They don't have the necessary funds. But it's not consistent when we see that others can benefit from subsidies. So this is a real issue. We need to maintain our mission. Those tools are there. We can't deny it. But we would like to have assistance in that regard. A question to everyone. For advertising from the federal government, the transfer of advertising from traditional media towards digital media since 2019, I've been in this role, and since 2019, the same thing has been asked, that the government spend less on foreign digital media and more on traditional media. The Friends of Canadian Media have been talking about that for years. I'm sorry, Mr. Chapeau, but your time is up. There's no time for an answer. You can answer a little later. Thank you. The next time, perhaps.
Mr. Diot, you now have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Dhanraj, I found your testimony quite fascinating. I was a journalist for myself for 30 years. I was also a national director of the Canadian Association of Journalists. Journalism has indeed changed. You noted that you used to sit down and watch Knowlton Nash as the voice of, a trusted voice. I also remember Lloyd Robertson as a kid watching him. Peter Kent, Stanley Burke. Ironically, Peter Kent stepped down in 1978 after criticizing political interference from the Liberal Prime Minister. So the CBC does talk about being diverse, inclusive, fair and balanced, yet one of the CBC's premier segments is something called At Issue, which features Toronto Star journalist Chantal Hébert, Athila Raj, and Globe and Mail journalist Andrew Coyne. In what universe is this diverse, fair, or balanced as a news panel?
Well, I mean, the National makes their own decisions, I suppose, in terms of who they put on that panel. and it's Rosie's panel, so Miss Barton's panel. So I guess you can have to talk to her about the editorial decisions. But what I was attempting to do on this program was have that diversity of opinion. And when they canceled the panel, I sent a note to panelists asking for feedback, and I was disciplined for that. And I just want to talk about this NDA that I got, because it's important. Because I was raising concerns about editorial, and I was slapped with this NDA here, which is a practice that the CBC is using frequently, which was raised by Dave Seglins, and you guys all have the paper. Dhanraj has considered whether he has a human rights complaint with respect to the issues in dispute, and by his signature below confirms that he does not. Further, he confirms that he seeks no right or remedy under the Canadian Human Rights Act as amended with respect to the issues in dispute, and any such claim is barred by this agreement. That should be shocking to every member on this committee. And I hope that other members on the committee take an interest in terms of the issues that I'm outlining here, because it is very important. We should not have a public institution silencing their own employees and having them waive their rights under the Canadian Human Rights Act. That should be shocking.
Getting back to the bigger issue of the fairness and balance in news, you mentioned at one point that CBC management actually prevented you from interviewing conservative leader Pierre Poilievre on your show. Can you describe what happened there?
Yeah, well, I basically wasn't allowed to pick up the phone and talk to conservatives. I have some G-chats here, which I just want to, read you part of this. I'm talking to my senior producer. I'm saying, okay, this is an editorial discussion. Can we get a conservative perspective on this is essentially what I'm saying. It is a no to the conservatives, I'm told. We can't chase anyone from the entire party. The chase is with PNP. So if Power and Politics is not able to secure a conservative or somebody that presents an alternate perspective, then we are not allowed to. I'm told at one point, we're sure that there's a myriad of other types of interesting guests that you can chase outside of the conservatives. Can I be included on conversations with Power and Politics? That's not how we work. I say to management, by playing petty office politics, we feed into conservative narratives that we have a bias against them. Canada Tonight is a melting pot of news of the day, and politics and decisions from it largely impact Canadians. So we need flexibility to respond to emerging stories. So yes, I wasn't even allowed to pick up the phone and call to request Pierre Poilievre. Look at what happened when I had Melissa Lantzman on my show. Right? I was threatened to be pulled off the air, which CBC then said in a news statement they didn't threaten to do that. There are recordings of them trying to do this.
Why do you think they were doing that?
I mean, there's an effort to essentially protect those in Ottawa in terms of their perspectives on these things, in terms of who they want on the show. It should be about, we did an interview with Karen Johnson, my co-host on the new podcast I'm doing. It is out right now. She's another former CBC employee that is talking about the toxic culture. She said that she alleges that she was called a brown Barbie, a bimbo, but she says that it's a very high school culture. And these are things that this is fine. If you have hosts doing that, it's not fine, but but management, you are responsible for dealing with it. And so if management is not going to do anything, if the president of the CBC is going to come here and expect a tongue lashing and then be able to go back to the CBC and continue to get funding without accountability, these practices will continue. So shame is clearly not enough to get the CBC to a place where they will hold themselves accountable. So it's incumbent upon this committee to do that.
Ms. Royer, you have the floor now for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Merci, Madame Chair. I'd like to begin by welcoming witnesses from my community, Janice Clue and Mario Bartel of Freshet News. Thank you both for your decades of service. When Glacier Media's Tri-City News closed last year, it was a devastating loss for our riding of Port Moody, Coquitlam. And I'm extremely grateful that veteran reporters like yourselves stepped forward
I'm
to launch
sorry,
Fresh It.
Ms. Royer.
Oh.
Your audio is a little low for the interpreters. I'm
Oh,
hearing
no.
that
Okay.
they are having trouble hearing you. Can you try moving your boom closer to your mouth and see if that's any
Is that
better?
better? Is that better? Madam Chair, is that better?
Yeah, I think it's better.
A little bit better? Okay.
Yeah, just keep that boom close to your mouth. It just sounded that you were a bit far away.
I'll keep it close. And is that, are we going to start the clock from the beginning?
No, you can have your time back.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, merci, Madam Chair. I'd like to begin by welcoming witnesses from my community, Janice Clue and Mario Bartel of Fresh.
No, I'm sorry, Ms. Roy. The
You're
audio
still
is
not getting
good.
it. Oh,
Right?
no. Okay. Let me just check the connection.
I'm going to suspend for a minute while we try and work this out, okay?
Okay. Merci.
Well, I was hoping this was just going to be a short little audio issue, but you know how it is when it comes to the government. It takes them forever, and usually they don't fix it. It's just the issue that it is. There was a little clip here while we're waiting for this to come back on. Oh. And we're back.
Monsieur Tumba.
The floor goes to Mr. Tumba for 5 minutes, starting now. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Excuse me. It won't be long. I'll start with Ms. Carrero. Thank you for your presentation. I think my colleague Fedes raised the point earlier. I'd like to hear you tell us about, well, community media outlets ask for advertising. How much can that help radio stations can survive? Well, in fact, as I was saying earlier, there's a subsidy that's received, but it doesn't cover the salary or barely of one employee for a radio station. So community radio stations have to be creative and find other ways, and advertising revenue are one of those ways to make up for that shortfall. There are also other ways of proceeding. Community radio stations have bingos, for example. That helps with funding as well. So these are ways to address a need that isn't covered by subsidies. So it's something very important and has always served the model of these media outlets. That's how they operated for a long time. It's nothing new. So it's a loss from recent years, and that's why we're really calling for a return of that advertising revenue. Thank you, Ms. Carrero. Mr. Bartel, Ms. Clue, what you experienced last year, I don't know how to describe it, but you are a model of resilience in the face of challenges, because despite what you went through, you came back, and we can tell you love media, you love your work. My question is, when you talk about having bigger donations, do you have like a number in mind in terms of funding?
Well, we did launch a founders club that allowed people to donate $1,000, a minimum $1,000, and we recognize them in ads in our newspaper, house ads in our newspaper, the campaign didn't really get going as strongly as we wanted to because we kept running into roadblocks with trying to issue tax receipts. We're not a charity. And a few efforts we did try would have run afoul of CRA, and we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to do anything illegal or that would come back and bite us. So we don't know. I mean, we got some support from our union and some other groups that did step up selflessly and say, we believe in this too. This is important. This is important for our community. But we don't know what kind of potential is out there if we don't have some of these tools available to us, like being able to issue tax receipts and that. And we spent a lot of time trying to investigate things. My colleague here, Janice, has spent a lot of time writing grant applications, and as we said, it's often fitting a square peg into a round hole where we're trying to get grants as cultural or as institutions, things like that we kind of fit into, but it all depends on how you look at it. So it's a lot of effort to find money wherever we can to try and give us that foundation that we can build upon.
Pour terminer, M. Deguin, j'ai vous entendu
Mr.
parler de votre
Deguin.
intervention.
I listened to your opening remarks. You want Canadian media, you want the government of Canada to consider them. Do you think some media outlets are not taken into account by the government of Canada? What would be your proposal to move forward?
L'année dernière, je pense.
Last year, I think the government spent about $75 million on advertising, but for all of the newspapers of Canada, it's less than $2 million. For La Presse in Montreal, when La Presse has a campaign, or let's say a big Canadian bank had a campaign in Quebec, La Presse did okay with ads, but the government gives them nearly zero. We are a great avenue to reach Canadians, but the agency of record means that it's more profitable, and these are programming ads like with Google. Thank you. Now the floor to Mr. Shampoo for 2.5 minutes. I'll talk to the Friends of Canadian Media. I was asking a question about the recurrent call, and it's not just from you, it's from all media owned in Canada. The government is disinvesting in traditional media and investing in online platforms, which are all owned by foreign companies. So do you think at some point the government will understand that part of the survival of our media depends on advertising by government, regardless of the level? But here we're talking about the federal government, which spends a lot of money on digital platforms compared to what it spends on traditional media. What is your position? Do you think we need to continue and be even louder on this?
I think there's two steps the federal government could take. First of all, as we said in our opening remarks, if they allocated even 25% of their annual revenue, annual advertising revenue budgets to publishers and broadcasters, that would have a substantial effect. Even a relatively small diversion of internet advertising revenue to Canadian news media would be hugely beneficial to these entities. Over and above that, as you mentioned earlier, the advertising deductibility issue has been something that Friends has been raising for countless years. We issued a report in 2017 and 2018 called Close the Loophole. I encourage everyone in the room and on the committee to Google the report and listen to it. This has been a long-standing issue. We think it's a simple, clean, easy measure that has a very successful precedent in traditional advertising, would actually raise money for government rather than cost money. And we haven't really seen any serious arguments against it. And quite frankly, the precedent has been in place since the 1960s. We think it would continue to be effective.
Madame Carrero, ce que ça représente comme...
Ms. Carrero, what would this be for community radio stations? It's a matter of survival for how many of your members, in your view? All of them. All of them. I'll say it again. Subsidies don't allow for their survival. It's advertising revenue to a greater degree. And there have been election campaigns. We saw it last year from the federal government. There was nearly nothing that was invested. Nothing was invested in local media. And yet the message would really have gotten through. But it's necessary for all radio stations. Thank you very much. I imagine it would be the same thing for written media. Weeklies are affected by this as well. Yes. In Ontario, the government of Premier Ford, the Conservatives, give 25% of their advertising budget to media. Thank you.
You have the floor now for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Dhanraj, I'm just curious, in your other remarks, or your previous remarks, I should say, sorry, you mentioned that there was a blacklist of, I think you said 45 people who were not permitted to appear on the CBC, and that this list came down from management. Would you be willing to table that list with committee today? Yes. Okay, thank you. Mr. Dhanraj, I'm curious, during your time, or do you have knowledge of the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, ever talking to the CBC with regard to how a news angle should be covered or taken, or content that should be reported on?
I know concerns were raised. I know concerns were raised from people that were on Power and Politics. I have documentation related to those concerns being raised. And I know that the folks that raise these concerns, they're fearful of, exactly the same thing that all of these other folks are fearful of, right? Professional reprisal. But I also know that this was raised repeatedly. And whether or not there was influence from the former Prime Minister's office in terms of editorial decisions that were being made on Power and Politics or not, even the allegation of that on its face needs to be investigated. And from my understanding, and CBC can put out a statement correcting me if I'm wrong on this, I don't think that there was ever an investigation. That is a serious concern, right? I mean, if there are repeated, allegations made about perhaps there's too much influence here. Now, let me just say this as well. I was a reporter in Ottawa. I've been at Queen's Park. I was the Queen's Park bureau chief for Global. Reporters have sources. We all know that. But there's a line where that leads into editorial decision-making, and you have to make sure that that is clear. And if there's even an allegation that may have been crossed, you have to look deeper.
I guess to that end then, we know that public trust toward the media in general is on the decline. We know that that is true with the CBC. There's no exception there. In your mind then, is that lack of trust justified?
I think that right now, the CBC, by continuing to put out statements and to come to these committees and say, yeah, we might have a little bit of a problem, but, overall, we're not biased. That's gaslighting Canadians. Canadians can see that this is an issue, right? And this is folks have accused me of coming here being a cheerleader for the Conservatives. I am not a cheerleader for the Conservatives. I'm sorry. I'm not a cheerleader for the Liberals either. I was trying to do my job as a journalist, and part of that is being balanced. And so when you have, when I was pulled into these disciplinary meetings, I was told that it was editorializing because I put that Catherine Tate wouldn't come on the program, and it's unfortunate. This is unfortunate, was editorializing, right? And it was perceived bias. There's a lot of perceived bias going on that I don't see any discipline around. So I think CBC needs to have a wake-up call here in terms of accountability. And really, that's incumbent upon this committee. I have made recommendations. There are 11 recommendations in terms of how to, move some of this forward. When it came to Mr. Cochrane, this is during the convoy, for example. We were talking about Tamara Litch, who was an individual who was involved in the convoy. We were doing a story around that. Off-the-hand remarks can be made at times. And I said, I think that she has a couple of different last names. People who live in trailers usually do. Okay, off-color remark, but if this is a pattern, right, you have to, if your staff on your own show are raising this, if people are leaving the program, you have to look a little bit deeper into it, as opposed to pulling me off the air for saying it's unfortunate the president didn't come on the show.
So the Canadian public is paying for this to the tune of about $1.4 billion. And then, of course, the government also increased that by an additional $150 million. At the end of the day, then, the public is the shareholder and also the ones that are supposed to be benefiting from this news coverage. In your estimation, what changes are needed to actually restore that trust?
Well, I think that there needs to be an overhaul when it comes to management. You have my specific recommendations, but I will also say this. I am not here as somebody who does not believe in public broadcasting. I was on Jonavision. I started as an audience coordinator when I was 19 years old at the CBC. I worked on the Air Farce. I worked on the Red Green Show. I then left. I came back. I worked at CBC Edmonton. I worked at CBC Toronto. Left. Came back again. I took a pay cut to come back to the CBC. I used to walk around the CBC Broadcast Center when I was 19 years old and sneak into the newsroom, and I thought, I want to be at this place at some point. This is the heart of this building, the news organization. And it has gotten so far away from what it was. The CBC should not be a polarizing force. It needs to bring Canadians together, and it has the infrastructure to be able to do that. But until there's a recognition of the problem from management, nothing will happen. And they fail to recognize this. I would be willing to sit down tomorrow with the new president to talk about some of this stuff, right? But good people are leaving, they're being forced out, and their concerns are being dismissed because it's about protecting reputation. Well, here's some news. I don't have to be wanting to destroy the CBC because management and executives are doing a great job of that on their own.
Thank you. We're going to try one more time with Ms. Royer to see if we have sound now that you have a new headset. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Fingers crossed.
Okay, excellent. So I'd like to begin by welcoming witnesses from my community, and that is Janice Clue and Mario Bartel of Freshet News. And I want to thank you both for your decades of service. And of course, when Glacier Media's Tri-City News closed last year, it was a devastating loss for our riding of Port Moody Coquitlam. And why is this? Because democracy only works when citizens can see the truth clearly, and that requires strong, independent journalism so that voters can make informed choices and hold leaders accountable. Janice, in your own words, you actually said that this is dangerous. So this brings me to the matter of journalistic integrity and the Journalist Code of Ethics. And I'd like to really drill down, if I could, with you and Mario. So with the advent of podcasts and online news, there's a great deal of misinformation. How were Freshet journalists trained, and is that the norm?
I was trained in Britain under a program called the NCTJ, National Council Training of Journalists. There's a standardized curriculum in colleges and universities in Britain. You do a year program and take legal courses, municipal government courses, shorthand. You then go out in the field for 18 months, and then we all write a national exam in the end. We don't have this in Canada. We need this in Canada. It's similar to a trade like Red Seal And it would help with municipalities that are struggling with reporters who call themselves reporters and they're not professionally trained. It would help with municipalities figure out who should be at the table, who should be at the media table.
Okay, got it. Can we drill down a little bit further and speak to the core principles? So, what really are the core principles of the Code of Ethics for journalists? What are the pillars?
Well, you try to be balanced. You try to give both sides of an issue. You try to give a fair representation of, when we cover city council, you try to give a fair representation of the concerns that were raised and how they were raised, so that when readers read how a decision came to be, they have some knowledge as to what some of the downfalls might be, what some of the advantages might be, and you just sort of, you report. You don't interpret, you report.
I'm actually understanding that, just to what you said, Mario, that accuracy and verification are absolutely key. Multiple sources, that there needs to be journalists themselves need to be free from conflicts of interest, and there can't be any exchange of gifts or favors. There is a high level of accountability and transparency. Can you speak to some of these principles and how you report, and also avoiding bias, how you bring that into Freshet News?
Well, I think we do as we've always done. We stand apart. We don't try and cultivate friendships or favor with anybody. We go in there and we go in with a fresh mind as to what is being discussed, what the issues are, and you give a fair ear to all sides and report accordingly.
I know that there was a gap between the closure of Tri-City News, Glacier Media, and Freshet opening. And of course, the closure happened just ahead of the election. What do you feel the impact was on the electorate in making decisions in the lead up to the election? What actually happened?
As we had said in the opening, we couldn't cover candidates, and the readers were lost. They didn't know who to vote for. They didn't know where to go. And again, it was very dangerous to democracy. So having corporate media pull out in the middle of the federal election was devastating to our readers and to the advertisers and to the candidates.
Well, in a normal news cycle too, we would be there covering all candidates' meetings and bringing readers who we're there. We're kind of the proxy for people who don't go, but still may be interested. They may not be interested in sitting around for 2 hours and at a meeting, or they just weren't able to go. So we're the proxy. That's how we see ourselves. Same city council, anything we cover, we're kind of the proxy for the public. So when you are able to give a flavor for a candidate and what they said and the issues that were raised by people at all candidates meetings, that's bringing information to the larger public as well, and hopefully that then informs everybody a little bit better about when it comes to marking their ballot, which way they're going to go.
We also cover a very
Yeah.
large. We also cover a very
Well, and I
large
noticed that there was a
cross-section.
prevalence of other sort of freelancers, journalists that we've never heard of before that were sort of taking up the space in the news desert. And I think people were then tuning into that because they were hungry. I think the electorate is particularly hungry for.
This is all the time we have for
reporting.
this question. I'm
Merci.
sorry,
Merci,
Ms.
madame.
Roy, but I really appreciate that you make the point that journalists have to be in the room at the school board meetings and at the city halls and in the courtrooms. And when people say AI can take over the job of journalism, I think they don't understand what journalism is then, because AI can't be in those rooms. Mrs. Thomas, you now have the floor for 5 minutes.
Awesome. I'm going to ask one quick question and pass it off to my colleague. My question is for Mike, Mr. Figgelman, or your colleagues. And my question is this. You made a statement with regards to linking the safety and security of the Jewish community here in Canada to biased coverage from the news media. And I would like you to take a moment and just expand on that in terms of the consequences that are there.
Sure. So you cut out there for a second. I'll speak to a bit of a portion, then I'm going to hand off to my colleagues on Zoom as well. The first thing is what's reported today becomes domestic and foreign policy tomorrow. And I echo Mr. Dhanraj's comments about a very, let's call it a jaundiced marketplace of ideas. What we have seen in the past couple of years, most certainly as it relates to the CBC, is the elevation of radical voices, giving them a platform, giving them undue legitimacy, which we feel really does serve to elevate the fringe and marginal voices who are traditionally, again, on the fringe, trying to work their way into the mainstream. And then it serves fundamentally to fan the flames of hatred against Israel and the Jewish community. More specifically, HR Canada Charitable Organization and InnoHives did a long-term 2-year study on the Hamas-Israel war, which found that there was this asymmetry in the CBC's coverage. Most specifically, that it elevated radical voices like Independent Jewish Voices, which is a radical anti-Zionist hate group, and giving them this platform. Again, it bestows this kind of credibility which they don't deserve. But I'll allow Dr. Haran Shaninarkis and Amanda Eskenazi to speak in more detail about their work.
So I'll just say briefly, first of all, thank you. Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me right? Hopefully? Okay. So I'm here as a scientist, and if there are any questions about the research we conducted, I'm happy to answer. I'll just say that taking into account the asymmetry that's already inherited in the Israeli-Gaza war, we found some very troubling evidence showing, for example, how the CBC is using headlines in order to promote one side of the story, such that even when you compare that to the actual reporting by the CBC
Madame la
and the way they...
Présidente, il y a un enjeu avec l'audio, encore une fois.
Madam Chair, there's an issue with the audio. The interpreters are struggling to interpret.
Okay.
I'm sorry, we don't have good sound for your intervention there.
Is that better right now? Or if not, maybe Amanda can take that? Is it?
I'm sorry, no.
Okay.
Okay, maybe I can try to speak to this then, and just sort of offer one final thought on this, that, my colleague Haran is a scientist, and he deals with data and numbers and, objective truth. I'm also a scientist, but a different kind. I'm a social scientist, and I look at behavior and trends and sort of human behavior and how people react to what it is that they see in the news and what they are presented with. And when we have a organization like the CBC, which is a Canadian institution that is supposed to be well respected, has a history in our country of being the place where you are supposed to be able to get real, honest news about what's going on in the world. And they are beating a very one-sided drum, a very one-sided narrative. And that's what's being offered to Canadians. Of course, Canadians are going to be angry. They're going to be upset because what they're being told, the reality is upsetting and angering. And when you only present one side of what is going on, you end up with a very ideologically, you end up with an ideology, you don't end up with reality and with the facts. And so I think when you are feeding Canadians, the CBC is not telling Canadians how to think about an issue. They're showing Canadians what to think about the issue, and that should not be the role of our public broadcaster. And as to just return it to your question, Mrs. Thomas, that if you have consistently one-sided narratives like this, of course you are going to have people who feel that they need to do something about it. And when we have one-sided narratives that demonize an entire group of people, because that's what's happening, then of course you are going to have people who are angry about that and feel that they need to do something about that. And that, unfortunately, is what we're seeing on the streets in Canada right now and what we saw this weekend in Toronto.
Thank you. Mr. Miles, you now have the floor for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for being here today and getting this study started off. in a very lively way. I want to talk, I think we're all very interested in making sure that there's a diversity of voices in journalism, and that's what makes great journalism. One thing I'm curious about is the right balance between, how we can create an ecosystem where the private broadcasters and journalists thrive, as well as a public broadcaster, like what the balance looks like, especially in rural communities. I find that one thing, and I think it speaks to what's been mentioned, is that often rural voices are not actually, particularly as more and more newspapers in small towns close, more and more radio stations in small towns close. How do we make sure that things aren't centralized just to the cities of Canada, but the voices of rural Canadians are also part of all the conversations we're having? Maybe I'll start with Paul to speak about that, if you get some thoughts.
So much. I think one of the programs that's important for rural voices is the Local Journalism Initiative. Many of our members would be a couple, let's say perhaps in their mid-70s. They own the local community newspaper. Their kids have moved to the city or doing something else. And the LJI is a way of getting a reporter into that community, invested in that community, covering cops, courts, city hall, that kind of stuff. So I think the LJI, in terms of the rural coverage, is absolutely critical. One thing I will say about the CBC, and this is an issue in particular in rural communities, CBC has been poaching journalists from community newspapers. And this is a problem. There's a terrific column written by Tim Schultz of the St. Albert Gazette, and I think you should all read it. It's in his own paper, and it's also in the National Post. But take a look at that. I mean, we're losing journalists to the CBC. They're getting more money, better benefits. And listen, we don't begrudge the CBC, but I'll give you just one example. Jeff LG, who's an entrepreneur who owns Village Media, Jeff trained a journalist. The journalist was hired by the CBC, went to Toronto. Jeff sort of felt okay about that. The journalist is in Toronto for a while. Then they move that same journalist back to the Sioux, competing with him, and he trained that journalist. And that's a real issue. It's an issue, in Franco-Manitoban communities, for example. This is an issue that we're very concerned about is the poaching of talent. And again, it's a free labor market, but to actually go after and pick off people from community newspapers in communities like Banff, it's just not fair.
I think it's part of what I'm looking to get at too is some of those places of conflict or whatever between the two sectors, and how we can actually seek to support both in the ideal world, and to make sure that those voices are not, particularly in the rural communities, not dismissed. Are there others?
I mean, I think, one of the challenges that we've got is Canada Post, and just in terms of sort of, distribution. So a lot of our members, these are a printed product, a community newspaper. Canada Post has made a decision that if you have a Canadian Tire flyer in your newspaper, it falls under something called the Consumer's Choice Program. So if a community says, for example, I don't want junk mail, essentially then you're not able to deliver that, newspaper to the community with a Canadian Tire flyer. And the Canadian Tire flyer, that might be for that particular publisher $75,000 a year in revenue. That's 2 reporters. So I think there's lots that the federal government can do to ensure that rural community news outlets thrive. And the CBC is one avenue, Canada Post is another.
Are you encouraged at all by the idea of CBC moving into rural communities and broadening the base of some of their stations?
Look, our view is CBC should be complementary, not competitive. And if they move into communities that are already well served, that's an issue. They should move to areas that aren't served. And when you look at the list that the CBC put forward in the editor's blog, they've done it twice in the last sort of year or so. Many of these communities are already well served by community newspapers, community radio stations, and so I think that's something we have to look at. They shouldn't be sort of predatory in the marketplace, if you will.
Very, very good. I had just one quick question on ad. Do I have a little bit of time?
Yeah, a little bit.
Just speaking with the ad thing, when you're saying, I'm curious to know when you say private enterprises actually kind of bought into local advertising even more than the government, what motivates that?
Because we're a great way of reaching Canadians. 86% of Canadians read newspaper content each week. When you advertise in a community newspaper, it's in a brand safe environment. Some of these digital ads you do, you have no idea where your ad is going to wind up on, some porn site or something or other, right? So we're a great way to reach Canadians. We're cost effective. And, we would, if we're getting ads from, the banks, the airlines, the telcos, et cetera, how come we're not getting ads from our own government? All of the federally regulated industries, the grocery stores, they all advertise with newspapers, and yet we don't really see a dime from the federal government. That's a problem.
Private sector.
But your time's up,
sorry.
Mr. Moss.
Thank you, Bob.
I gave you a bit of leeway there, but there's a limit. Monsieur Champoux, je vous passe la parole pour.
Mr. Champoux, I will give you the floor for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Fegelman, you surprised me earlier when you talked about radical comments that distort media coverage. You have an organization, Honest Reporting, that looks at the accuracy of reporting with the conflict in Israel against Hamas and now the conflict with Iran. And I think that's quite fine to have groups that look at the quality of journalistic coverage with a conflict situation. It's even more delicate. I think that's good. I think it's important. But your methods are unacceptable, Mr. Fegelman. You have a website where you directly attack journalists who have coverage work that does not please you. And that, to me, I don't understand how you call yourself someone who looks at the quality of coverage when you use methods that look like harassment. Laura Julie Perrault, Magdalene Boutros are targeted on your website. Rather than calling out the coverage that you find not good enough, you attack the work of the journalists and you encourage your supporters to write directly to them, and you give them a template to write directly to them. Thousands of emails have been sent to those journalists, and maybe to others. Do you think that harassment method of journalists is a constructive way to ensure that coverage of these very important and sensitive issues? Do you think that harassment method of journalists is the right one? Do you stand by that?
For your question, Mr. Champoux, if I may answer your question with a question to you, when your constituents contact you with concerns and complaints, would you characterize that as harassment?
Pas du tout, parce que
Not at all. My constituents expect that I do the work, and they elected me, and they have the right to contact me directly. You could contact the media that hires these people. You could be in touch with the CBC ombudsman. That's how it works. You don't directly contact the journalist. It becomes personal. It becomes an attack on the work and often the integrity of the person, because you are going after someone who shouldn't be receiving thousands of nonsense emails. As politicians, we expect this. It's part of the job. Journalists shouldn't be undergoing this. So go after elected officials, those who manage CBC Radio-Canada, La Presse, Le Devoir, but let journalists do their work and have comments from their bosses. Don't you think that would be the right way to proceed?
We regard ourselves as an added layer of editorial oversight. In a world where we're hearing of massive cutbacks in the Canadian journalism landscape, where there's less verification, we found that actually most journalists value the work that we do, because that may surprise you, because we are pointing out the unfairness.
Est-ce que vous êtes en mesure, dans ce cas-là, parce qu'il me reste très peu de temps?
In that case, because I have very little time, I'm sorry. Are you able, because I have very little time left, are you able to provide the names of journalists who support your work, journalists and media, not commentators, credible ones? Which journalists support the style of approach you have with journalists regarding the quality of their work? We could have this conversation for a long time. I think the chair will interrupt me soon, but if you want to respond to what I've just said, I would be pleased to read your comments. You could write to the committee, send all of the documents you wish, and we can even pick up this conversation, you and I, afterwards, because I think this is a very important issue. It's about the credibility of your comments, which could be very good in this debate. Perhaps they can provide that information to the committee. If you can come back with those names that Mr. Shampoo has asked for, that would be later that we would accept that information, because we're out of time.
Request to go 2 minutes for each party before we finish this conversation, before we get to Mr. Shampoo. Is that okay? Everybody okay with that? Okay. Mrs. Thomas, you have 2 minutes.
I'll be taking this 2 minutes. Yeah, Mr. Fegelman, it was very interesting when you said that you indicated that a CBC executive said that the network shouldn't refer to Hamas as a terrorist group, even though the government of Canada has recognized them as a terrorist group since 2002. Why should the public be alarmed at this?
Well, in the Canada Gazette, it is publicly listed that they are a terrorist group. Their day job is to strap a suicide vest on themselves and with the intent of maiming and murdering innocents. When our media sanitize language, it effectively legitimizes the actions, or at least it distorts. People aren't fully aware that what these people do, what their intentions are, is to wipe Israel and Jews off the map. So it is really misrepresenting the facts on the ground. Language matters. Diction matters.
Now, your organization did do a deep dive into the coverage that happened throughout CBC since October the 7th. Can you just reiterate some of that coverage? And you allege it was highly biased.
Well, I'd like to recount a couple of examples of CBC bias that we've come across. The first, on February 16th, CBC Radio Canada's correspondent Elisa Serrett, who was later suspended, uttered an anti-Semitic trope on air when claiming that, and I quote, the Israelis, in fact the Jews, finance a lot of American politics and control a big machine. It's a clear-cut anti-Semitic trope. CBC continues to use reporters who've expressed radical anti-Israel views. They have a journalist named Sarah Jabakanji who in 2021 signed an open letter boldly proclaiming that there should be more pro-Palestinian coverage. That's just at the CBC. I would refer you to my colleague Amanda Eskenazi, who can talk in specifics about some of the results of the study that they did about the CBC's bias.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. We just have 2 minutes for everybody. It's a really quick, it's like, we call it the lightning round, kind of like a game show. Mr. Miles, you have 2 minutes.
Sure. You know, I think I'll just go right back to Paul because we get a little interrupted. I'm sorry to keep on going back at you, but because I am curious about this advertising piece, because I hear you. I hear what you're saying as an opportunity, obviously, to support these, journalists and the work of these papers and broadcasters. But at the same time, there has been a decline in private advertising in newspapers, certainly. Like that's a fact as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So just for ballpark numbers, so advertising in Canadian newspapers a dozen years ago would have been about $3.5 billion. Today, it's probably 900 million or so.
Okay, so the private sector has also abandoned that route.
I wouldn't say abandoned. I'd say they've changed in terms of their spend, but we're still doing okay in terms of a lot of community newspapers. I mean, if you pick up a community newspaper, you're going to see the ad from the Chevy dealer. You're going to see, the ad from the Remax agent. Like we still do okay. But disproportionately, we don't do well with government, and in particular with the federal government.
That's interesting. And is it because they believe that this is where the eyeballs are? They should go where the eyeballs are? Is that not?
So the government has an agency of record, right? And I think this dates back to the sponsorship era, or the sponsorship scandal from years ago. So the government has an agency of record that makes the decision. It used to be COSAT, it's now WPP. I think that those firms have done what is easiest and most profitable for them, which is programmatic advertising, those ads that just sort of pop up everywhere. You develop much more of an impression. If you take out a full-page ad in the Killiel de Saint-Hyacinthe, par exemple, you're going to make much more of an impact than a little programmatic advertising that pops up.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate you.
I know there's lots of individual MPs advertising in our local media, but that's a different budget, and I won't get into it. La parole est à vous, Monsieur Champoux.
Now you have the floor, Mr. Champoux, 2 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I didn't know I'd have this additional 2 minutes. I'd feel bad if I didn't give Mr. Fegelman the opportunity to respond to my comments. I thought we would continue our conversation by email or otherwise, but Mr. Fegelman, I'll give you a minute to respond to what I said earlier if you wish. If you want to pick up.
I didn't hear your question when you first asked. If you don't mind asking the question, forgive me, the audio is terrible for me.
La question là que je viens de vous poser.
Yeah.
The question I just asked? Well, I'm giving you the opportunity to respond to what I said earlier. We ran out of time for you to respond.
Est-ce que la traduction, est-ce que vous avez la traduction en
Are
anglais?
you having the interpretation into English? Do you hear the interpretation? Testing on the English channel.
We want to make sure that our system is working properly. Is it that you can't hear or that there's no translation?
I can hear the translation.
English channel. If I speak, can you hear the English? Is the English interpretation coming through? Is there a problem? Testing on the English channel. 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? Interpretation into English. Is this working for you? Can you hear? Okay. Okay. I didn't have my microphone on. Is it working now? Is it working better?
Okay. Allez-y, Monsieur Champoux.
Go ahead, Mr. Champoux. My question wasn't really a question, Mr. Fegelman. I was giving you the opportunity to respond to what I said earlier. We were interrupted. We ran out of time. So I am proposing that you respond to my comments for a minute rather than having this conversation later. I was just giving you the floor to respond.
I'll give you an example of some of the dialogue we had in recent days. We filed a complaint with the Globe and Mail to their standards editor because they had published a column that had said that Israel takes Palestinians hostage, which it does not do, which is a violation of international law. We filed a complaint. They received it, they appreciated it, and they took corrective measures to issue a correction. That's the kind of what we consider to be constructive dialogue that is important. And I would also say, with your comment about alleged harassment, if any of our subscribers, we have about 80,000 subscribers from coast to coast, if anyone engaged with a member of the media in a way that we felt was unprofessional, strident, knee-jerk reactionary, we would be the very first to either try to sensitize them to our concerns, and if they weren't listening and were uncooperative, we would take them off our list. We don't think that that is helpful. We think it's actually quite counterproductive.
Donc, si les journalistes émettaient, excusez-moi, si des journalistes...
So if journalists told you they were embarrassed, they were bothered, there's little time, but if journalists told you, we don't agree with the way you're operating, we'd prefer for comments, criticism, discussion of that nature be done with the editors or the bosses of newsrooms rather than journalists directly, you would be open to that? You would be open to that dialogue?
We're certainly open to any kind of dialogue with any different leverage point in the Canadian media landscape. Our challenge, though, is what we oftentimes encounter is window dressing of accountability and evasive efforts in terms of implementation of journalistic standards. Meaning we could bring a grievance to a journalist editor and they may not reply and are totally evasive. And we think that that's quite problematic. So I think there is a necessity for an oversight mechanism. I think, broadly speaking, our goal should be that, look, a very Canadian response with civic engagement, because I think that's fundamentally constructive.
Ouais, c'est là qu'on n'est pas d'accord, Monsieur Fegelman. Je pense que
That's where we don't agree, Mr. Fegelman. I think at a certain point we have to accept the processes in place. It's not up to journalists or workers who didn't ask to have that relationship to have that harassment directed at them. I think there needs to be a line drawn somewhere, and I think the way you proceed with your call to contact journalists directly by email, I think you're crossing that line. That's my opinion. I think on that we can end and we can talk about the motion. Yes, exactly. If you wish to begin, Mr. Shampoo, you can introduce. No? Let's go ahead. Well, we can continue 5 minutes.
If you'd like, we're going to discuss the motion that Mr. Shampoo rose earlier today. You don't have to leave. You can stay to the end, but we have finished with our questioning of you. I hope it was not too onerous. We truly appreciate all of your participation. And keep in mind that you're welcome to send in any further information or documentation. I know, Mr. Dhanraj, you've been asked to supply certain documents to this committee, but we can take all of that. Or if there's something you forgot to say, for example, don't hesitate to reach out to the committee, and we can include all of that in our consideration of our report. Thank you again. Mr. Shampoo?
Merci, Madame la
Mr.
Présidente.
Shampoo, thank you, Madam Chair. I read the motion earlier so that it would be on the record. I just want to give a little bit of context. In Quebec, last week we learned that Radio-Canada had chosen to make available on Prime Video, owned by Amazon, an American giant, which has trouble respecting our laws to give a framework for digital giants. That news was a real shock because Radio-Canada's programming will be available on Prime Video and is not available on 2.tv, Radio-Canada's platform, which should offer all of the chains offered by the public broadcaster. So we've seen this in the media. People will say it's Québécois commentators really emphasize this. Yes, that's true, but we've also seen it in La Presse and in other media. This is something that really shocks people. It's stunning. I see that they want to reach as many people as possible. I understand that. They want to be available, and we want to have discoverability of content, journalistic and cultural content, but in our view, it's very difficult to justify offering this streaming on an American platform on Prime Video, regardless of the motives, the strategic motives of that decision, before it is offered on a platform that is owned in Canada. So that's the purpose of this motion, to invite Ms. Bouchard to come explain the decision, to answer questions from parliamentarians so we can understand the decision and understand why Quebecers and Francophones across Canada can't have access to RDI on a Canadian platform. If not 2.tv, the platform Canadians are already paying for. Mr. Généreux. We agree with the motion. However, I would add, well, I would give Mr. Shampoo the opportunity to say if it's a good addition or not, but I think it would be good to hear from people who criticize this decision. So journalists, former employees, or programming directors from RDI who are very outspoken right now on this in Quebec. This is a decision that has people with their jaws dropped right now because it doesn't make sense. Amazon doesn't distribute through its platforms news. It has cut news that's produced and distributed in Quebec and Canada, especially in French. And now this company is contesting a decision by the government of Canada. So regarding the 5%, and some witnesses will surely tell us in the coming weeks, well, it's just inconsistent. And I think other people should also have the opportunity to speak, not just Radio-Canada. I don't know if Mr. Shampoo is open to that.
Next, et puis je reviens.
Mr. Miles, and then I'll come back. I think it would be worthwhile to have just the CEO alone for this discussion, but if we can add the opportunity to talk about the strategic plan as well of Radio-Canada at the same time. For this discussion is important, of course, but we could also talk about the strategic plan of Radio-Canada. So I would add that as an amendment.
Monsieur Shampoo?
C'est parce que là, je veux
Mr.
juste...
Shampoo, I want to see if Mr. Miles is proposing an amendment, but Mr. Geneder was proposing a friendly amendment earlier for the order of priority. I don't know how you want to operate. Yes, this is true. Mr. Geneder, that was a friendly amendment?
I would
propose we add a meeting. So 2 meetings, 2 hours each, so we could have more witnesses who could be invited. Does everybody agree with that? Okay, we agree with that, to have a second meeting. And Mr. Miles, do you have another amendment? Or is it covered? No, it's an amendment that would say that, well, it's an amendment to the motion on the first meeting with the CEO of CBC Radio Canada to talk about the strategic plan. It's a small amendment. I agree with the clerk. She can come and talk about anything when she comes. I don't know if it's necessary.
Okay. Mr. Shampoo.
Mr. Shampoo. It's a little what I was going to say. I agree with adding a meeting, if it's the will of the committee, to hear from other witnesses on this topic, the decision of ADE and Prime Video. That's what I was going to say to Mr. Miles. Once Ms. Bouchard is here, if we want to ask questions on strategic planning, I think that's not even unrelated, because maybe this decision is due to strategic planning. So it's the same theme. I don't think it needs to be added to the motion. We don't need to have an amendment on this. As long as it's understood that way. It's understood that when a witness comes, you can ask the questions you wish, as long as it's on topic.
Est-ce qu'on a besoin de passer au vote, Madame la Présidente?
Do we need to have a vote, Madam Chair?
Je pense qu'il y a consensus.
I think there is consensus. Do we want to talk about a date for witnesses? I didn't put a date in the motion on purpose because I think the study we have before us currently is important and we've waited some time. However, I think it should be the priority after the current study. So the first thing we do after the study would be to hold this short 2-meeting study. I totally agree. We could have split it in 2, so we could have had these 2 meetings. But we can wait, but we would need to ensure that all members here don't ask questions when the CEO is here. So really we can cover this outside of our current study. Because if we start to ask questions on this already, well, I can't tell others what to do, of course. Well, to really try not to confuse the issues, maybe the CEO of Radio Canada CBC will talk about this when she comes. It might, well, personally, I would have suggested a date to meet with the CEO of CBC Radio Canada and other witnesses as soon as possible to deal with this issue.
Le risque que les deux s'entremêlent va être...
The 2 might overlap when she's here.
Ouais, je pense pas qu'on peut dire aux députés.
I don't think we can tell members what to ask the witnesses. They can ask what they want. But as was said, the 2 topics are linked. As Mr. Shampoo said, I take your point, but I don't think we can tell members. Mr. Miles?
Yes.
As long as it's not something that she comes and then 2 weeks later she's here again. Well, maybe that would be good for the CEO to come here often, but if she comes as a witness for this study, because that's what will happen, that it not be, because we have other studies too. So I totally agree to have her come. But if we ask the questions at that point, what happens when she comes 2 weeks later? So if you agree, I'm flexible. It's just to mention that it could be a little strange to have her in once and then often again, and we've already asked the questions on the platform.
To us, and if it gets repetitive, it gets repetitive. The clerk has heard from the CBC that they are available on April 14th to come on the study that we're in the middle of now. So it's kind of in the middle. We could finish the study and be inviting them right back again, but that's okay. Monsieur Généreux?
Mr. Généreux, I know the Vice President did an interview, I think it was last week. Today's Tuesday. I wouldn't be surprised if Radio Canada sent someone else than the CEO, but that's not what we want. That's the tricky thing. We want to have the CEO come debate this issue, because this is a fundamental issue regarding Radio Canada. They receive $1.4 billion, and the minister announced potential cuts. They receive $1.4 billion a year, CBC Radio Canada, and Canadians will have to pay $9.99 to have access to RDI if they don't have cable, and they'll have to go through an American company. The issue is, why would 2 TV and GEM not be free in Canada? And personally, after paying so much money as a Canadian, I think asking the question to Canadians, it would be pretty clear that they shouldn't have to pay again to have shows that are supposed to be special, or to see a show a little bit earlier than it comes out. I think it's absurd. So that question will be raised as well. The 2 hours with the CEO is necessary, and then other witnesses we can ask them questions on those decisions as well. That's important. Now, within the study we're doing, we're talking about fairness in media. Yes, it's about fairness at the macro level. I think we need to ensure we have a meeting or two, as we've just decided, on just this issue. I understand Mr. Miles' prerogative will invite her, and then we'll invite her again. I'd be very surprised if she came twice, 3 weeks apart. I'd be very surprised, because generally speaking, they don't really like to come here, especially the CEO. So I'm not sure she'll want to come twice. So what I would propose is to have a date in the motion on this specific issue, and so we could have a discussion with Radio Canada. I think it will be an invitation after we finish the study, but I'll go to Mr. Champoux and then Mrs. Thomas. 2 things, because question period is coming up. When we invite Radio Canada, it's always the CEO who comes. It's her work, it's in her mandate. She's the link between the public broadcaster and the federal government. We determined earlier that there would be 2 meetings after the study underway. There won't be any issue with the frequency. Ms. Bouchard will come when she's invited. We'll have some flexibility with her busy schedule, but I have no doubt that she'll be delighted to come before the committee if we invite her. She really likes us.
Well, I know she really likes me. Sure. I guess just a quick comment here. I think we have no control over what the folks at this committee determine to ask the CEO when she comes. Obviously, the issue that has been brought forward by Mr. Champoux is a timely one. It's one that matters. And so should folks, wish to ask questions with regard to that, it absolutely 100% relates to the study at hand, which has to do with fairness in the media. And there's a big question around this. Is the CBC being fair when they're requiring payment on top of tax dollars that have already been extended to them for this type of programming? So anyways, all that to say, everybody here is a duly elected member of parliament and has complete freedom to ask the questions that they feel need to be asked.
Agree. And just to be clear, we will be inviting CBC on this study, and then when this study is done, we will invite them again on the study that Martin has proposed. So it'll be 2 different studies. When they come for this study, they'll be as part of a panel, a wider panel. So it's not like they'll be here on their own anyway. All right. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mr.
Là-dessus, si vous lisez le document.
On that, if you read the original motion, the minister would come alone for 2 hours, and the CEO would be here for 2 hours. Am I mistaken on that? Yes? There was an amendment adopted to have the minister alone, and then on a panel, the CEO of Radio-Canada. Okay?
Adjourned.
Well, bit of a gong show going on as usual. Martin Champeau, I tell ya, the guy is absolutely toxic. If ever you were to prove you were anti-Semitic, I think he covered that in the first 2 minutes he opened his mouth. The Quebec end of it are very, very hardcore atheists. They believe all religions should be squashed, pretty much. And the Liberal government with the Bill C-9 is following suit. Of course, this is to secure the Quebec vote that they get on the Liberal Party, but it's also to appease the extreme leftists. The new religion is climate religion. Canada's in big trouble. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed that live broadcast. I definitely got a few clips I will be cutting out of there for some shorts because people need to see it, and I'll be posting it to, of course, all of the other social media accounts I'm on. Thanks, guys. I appreciate you tuning in. Until next time, stay informed.